Join us today on Beyond the Lair, where we have a conversation with Clint Davis, Senior Advisor for Scotiabank. Also, most importantly, a court judge on Season 2 for the Bears Lair. We talked to Clint about growing up in the North, graduating from Harvard, and becoming the CEO of Cedar Capital, the first Indigenous-owned investment dealer in Canada. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Beyond the Lair. We are very pleased today to have our guest Clint Davis, the great Clint Davis, on as one of our guests. He is one of our core judges for the Bears Lair Season 2, which is coming out June 4th. So we're very excited. Clint is going to be one of our core judges and very excited to talk to him about that. And he is the first core judge to be interviewed before the beginning of the show, June 4th. So really happy to have you, Clint. My name is Geena Jackson. I am one of Geena Jackson Montgomery. I'm one of the co-hosts of the Beyond the Lair, and I'd like to introduce my other co-host.
Hi, I'm Dean Montgomery, and it's great to see you, Clint.
Great to see you as well. Thanks for having me.
Very excited to have you on the show. So Clint Davis has a whole financial background, and really excited for everyone that doesn't know Clint to get to know him better, and everyone that knows him to learn a little bit more about him. But currently now has a position as senior advisor for Scotiabank, but also has some very exciting news coming up to be the CEO for a company called Cedar that we're going to be talking about. So welcome, Clint, to our programming.
I'm really excited to be here, and it's really great to see the two of you, and looking forward to Season 2 as well.
Excellent. Why don't we go back in time a little bit and talk about, I'm First Nations, Dean's Métis, you're Anak, and tell us a little bit about your childhood and where you grew up and what brought you to the point of where you are today, your education, and what led you to this path.
Thank you. It's, the one thing when I was a kid, it was, I always thought I'm sort of that only type of person that exists right now because of my family situation, which I'll get into in a second. But once you start interacting with other Indigenous people across the country, you realize that it's quite common. My mom was very, very young when she had me. And so my mom and my dad never married, and I was raised by my grandparents. My dad is Inuk from Nunatsiavut, which is in Labrador. It was the last Inuit land claim to be settled in Canada. He's from a small community called Rigolet, which is the southernmost Inuit community in that region. And my mom is from a small southern Inuit town called Cartwright. And she grew up there. It was an isolated community. And they ended up going to Goose Bay, Labrador, which was the big town because it was built by the Americans, and it was Air Force Base. And so many people from both the North Coast and South Coast actually moved there for work. My grandfather was a hunter and a fisherman and a trapper, and he ended up becoming the mayor of this small town and then going over to becoming a cook with one of the military organizations there. I actually got a lot of influence from my grandparents in terms of commitment to land, understanding and appreciating sort of the significance of the land, and frankly, hard work. Every summer we would actually go to our cabin. So in Southern Ontario, and I'm sure probably out around Vancouver, you hear about people going out to the cottage, and, in Southern Ontario anyway, some of those cottages are like stainless steel, appliances and so on. And you can get there by driving, and people complain about the traffic. When we would go to the cabin, we would actually have to get on a ferry that would take 24 hours to get to the community of Cartwright, which then you would get into a speedboat and you'd go out into kind of very close to the North Atlantic, and then go to our cabin, which was another hour away. And when you were there were no roads, nothing of that nature. And so I'd be there for almost the full summer, and my grandparents were inshore fishermen, and they would sell their catch and give them a little bit of money for going back home. And that would be my summer. At the time, I couldn't stand it, right? Like you had to go there, and it was hard work, and you had to be out, working with my uncles, my aunts, all the, like around fishing, etc. And it was tough. But as I got older, I started to reflect on that, and I found it. I kind of realized I was pretty lucky to kind of have that experience and to just have a small glimmer of what life was like. Certainly before everyone moved to larger towns, and we became more integrated in that respect. So that's a little bit of kind of background where I'm from, and sort of connection to community and connection to family.
How did you get into the financial business?
Yeah.
Where did you go to school? How did you do this?
So it's funny because I I sort of hooked onto my cousin, who is my best friend, and his parents were teachers, and so he was sort of expected to do well in school, and I was just like, oh, I think I'm kind of as smart as he is. And my grandmother, I think, got grade 10, and my grandfather got grade 6. And say that education wasn't a priority. My grandfather was a voracious reader and would recite poetry and so on, and when he was on his trap line, but for them, the biggest thing was to just make sure I could earn a living. I would have some sort of skill set that I wouldn't be living with them when I'm 40. And if I were to ever have a family, that I would be able to take care of my family. So I just hooked on to my cousin, and he was expected to university. I ended up going to university, and I did one of those things in the 80s where you go to your guidance counselor and they try to determine what your attributes are. And it determined that I was relatively numerate. And so either finance or chemistry was kind of where I should go. And so I chose finance, and had an opportunity to go to Acadia University, where I did my undergrad in business. From there, I did a little bit of work for a bank, but then I kind of moved right into law school because there was a tremendous program for Indigenous young people at the University of Saskatchewan called the Native Pre-Law Program, and enabled me to have access to Dalhousie Law School. And from there, I thought I was going to be a criminal lawyer, doing some business law as well, but ended up joining the government and was very interested in land claims because my community was going through that process at the time. And so my career, Geena and Dean, is just sort of there's no linear kind of approach to it. Like I'm always pleasantly surprised when I see people when they said, no, I was going to be a lawyer, I was going to be a banker, and this is what I'm doing, da da da. And so mine is just kind of all over the map. And while probably hasn't resulted in massive accumulation of wealth, I think it has resulted in massive accumulation of experience and knowledge, and for which I'm forever grateful. I was really interested, particularly during my time in public service, the interface between Indigenous governments and communities and business, and the interaction with the federal government at the time. And so I thought that working with banks would probably be a really good way of being able to participate and add value, and hopefully have an impact. And so from my time in government, I went back to school, to the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, where I did pursue that a bit deeper on the business side. I became, I was mentored by Ron Jameson, who's just this prolific individual in the area of Indigenous finance, and had the opportunity to work closely with him, took over his role when he retired. And then shortly after a stint as CEO of CCAB, I became the vice president for Indigenous banking at TD Bank.
Yeah, and for our listeners and that don't know you personally, like we've gotten to know, which we're so thankful for, is Clint is really truly one of the nicest guys you'll meet, and so well-rounded. And I think your education speaks volumes to that. And you always look just awesome in a suit as well.
Oh. Yes, lovely, very lovely and handsome. And it's interesting because we had our podcast this morning. Most viewers and listeners don't know, this is like TV time as well. This is not a live. We filmed 4 podcasts in one day. We had one this morning with Chastity Davis. Amazing. Susanna Pierce was our second. And then of course, Sheila North after you, and just people that no one has anything to say bad about. Every single person that has, that your name is mentioned, everyone has something really positive to say about it. Your reputation of just being the ultimate trustworthy, transparent, nice person, nice guy, just precedes you in every way that we go. And that's why we were so thrilled when the lovely Tabitha Bowl recommended you to be one of the core judges for the Bears Lair, and it was just absolutely phenomenal. And we thank you so much for that.
Yeah, but Geena, I have to say, for you and Dean, and look, like I'm going to be honest, like Geena, you're the brains behind the operation. No
Thank
offense,
you.
Dean. Listen,
Thank you. Thank
like
you.
the one thing that
Thank you. I appreciate
the
that.
one
I'll
thing
give you money later.
yeah, the one thing that the two of you have done, and you've done it time and time again, and you reinforce this, I think, particularly when it comes to the show, but as well as the work that you're doing beyond that, including this podcast, is your commitment to inclusion. And so, as you said, you're a very proud First Nations woman. Dean, I know you have such pride in your Métis roots and your commitment to community. And, it's oftentimes very easy to forget about the North. And it's very easy to forget about those isolated communities for which, as you know, Geena, we have 54 Inuit communities in Canada. 50 of them are on diesel, 50 of them are isolated, right? So the fact that you took the time, you wanted to ensure that you had that Inuit voice, you had Inuit contestants in the past, and you have that, I believe, this natural commitment and affinity for the North, was a significant part of our country. I just think that just speaks volumes in terms of the leadership, Indigenous or non-Indigenous, frankly, the leadership that the two of you just project as a result of that.
Oh, you're so lovely. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that. I wanted to go back to talk about the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, and in its infancy when you started there, and where you saw it when you began working with them, and what was created through your leadership, and then of course it being going to JP, and then now with the amazing Tabitha Bull. With great leadership and really expanding this program. I know we're going to see each other at the 40th anniversary for the CCAB, which is next week, the 27th, 28th, 29th, where they're celebrating 40 years of achievement. And you were a huge part of that. So maybe we can talk about the CCAB and where it began and where you see it now.
CCAB itself was quite an institution when I decided to join. And I was lucky that the board actually decided to bring me on board. I always thought I served on the board for a small period of time because BMO was a huge supporter. And I just thought the very essence behind it was established was just incredibly valuable for the country, which is, it wasn't a focus on non-Indigenous business to kind of, be forced into having to hire Indigenous people or to do a little bit of business with them. Nor was it just focused on Indigenous business or Indigenous people trying to figure out how do we become involved and create value for ourselves, our communities, our businesses with the larger private sector. But it was all about trying to build those bridges, right? And what kind of programs would be in place? What kind of events can you establish? What kind of support that you can provide? And all of this was sort of done well before, and it started in the 80s. It was done well before we actually had the case law, which I believe, frankly, some of the most prolific case law was coming out of the West Coast in terms of establishing what is an Indigenous right, what is Indigenous title, et cetera, right? And so it was done because, frankly, you actually had a couple of business leaders who said, look, there's a huge population here in our country. Certainly, you see higher concentrations of it in certain parts of the country, particularly Northern Ontario, the prairies, and BC. And so what can we do in order to get this done? And so it started to really build out its brand. And when I came on board, my goal was to see what I can do in order to really leverage that and see what's successful and, add some additional pieces to it that I thought that would be able to be important for folks. Now, one of the things that I was very, very, very proud of when I was there, and it was because of the experience I had in terms of doing some work with Catalyst Canada. So Catalyst Canada is an organization commitment to ensuring that women are represented across executive ranks and so on for all types of work. And one of the things they did exceptionally well was to put out research. And so, it's one thing to advocate, but if you're advocating without the necessary research and data behind you, your advocacy would be rather limited, right? Mm-hmm. And so we had very limited information, data, or research papers on the Indigenous business market. And as the two of you know as well, in the mid to late 90s, a lot of the work that was going on was usually around some of the social challenges that were existing with our communities. And so the stories that were coming out of this, all that, research was important, it was vital, it gave insight as to what some of those critical issues are. But it did create this narrative that I think people didn't realize that, we in fact were active contributors to the economy. So when I worked at the Bank of Montreal, I'd be having discussions with senior executives within the bank and saying, well, how big is this market? I said, well, it's really big. And I said, well, how big? And I'm like, I don't know, but it's big. Like, when you go and you're in BC, you can kind of see it. It's in your face. But that and, $5 will maybe get you a coffee at Starbucks, probably not in light of inflation. So we just said, you know what? Catalyst Canada has done a phenomenal job at this. Why don't we kind of partner with some of their researchers and see what we can do in order to really identify some of this work? And so we started with a very short report looking at kind of what the PAR, or Progressive Aboriginal Relations, committed and successful companies have been doing. What were some of their best practices? Because we weren't even tracking that and being able to communicate that. So we started with that, got a little bit of traction. The other critical piece, and this is where the two of you are exceptional at, which is not only should you have research, you got to have research that is digestible because you're dealing with the private sector, people with huge pressures on their time. So anywhere from, there's like a page count, 10 to 15 to 20 pages. And you got to have a media strategy. Like if you have the document that's out there just sitting on a shelf, it's adding very limited value. Put some media around this to create that narrative so that people are being aware of this. It moved on to a number of other reports, but one thing I just wanted to comment on really quickly was the report on size of the Indigenous. I think the reason why it kind of came to light for me was I was at an event, and one of the politicians there, and I can't remember if it was federal or provincial, talked about, we just really wish that, Indigenous people could become involved in the economy and really come out and try to find work and try to get a job. And I'm like, so at the time I was the chair of my community's development corporation back home. I knew what we were doing. We were tracking how many Inuit we had working for us. We had our own procurement policy in place and supporting other Inuit business in the communities in the region. And so this was just a fallacy, right? And so we actually partnered with TD Economics and said, let's size the Indigenous economy for the first time ever in the history of the country. And we looked at the buying power of Indigenous businesses, people, and governments. And with the government side, because you had politicians saying, we're spending $9 billion on First Nations. Well, what are we getting for our money? Well, first of all, you're not getting sued. Secondly, this is a fiduciary obligation on the part of the government. However, we only took 2%, the discretionary funding of government. And when we determined that, the size of the economy at the time, I think, was like $30 billion, which is bigger than two provinces, the economies of two provinces put together, right? So, and the strongest part of that, the most intense concentration, was Northern Ontario, the prairies, and BC, where you see the largest population. And so what was great about that is I think that was actually quoted like thousands of times, right? And you had people who I know who work in large scales who were using that report as a part of their own market strategy and so on for the analysis that they were doing. And now when you see the brilliance of Caroline Hilton, who's just taken this and she's just, I think, this was a very basic kind of report. TD was exceptional at that as well, and has just taken this, pulled it apart, and actually has really put a lot of rigor around where we actually think the Indigenous economy was going. It was really funny to hear so many people going, I had no idea, including communities. Like the strength of the buying power of Indigenous communities in Manitoba and Alberta. They're like, I had no idea that we contributed $400 million to the Saskatchewan economy, right? And like that's real influence. And we saw that in some instances, if you're not doing what you should be doing, or even considering the market of Indigenous people in some of these regions, you're doing that at your peril.
Yeah, absolutely. All this, the work that you've been doing and actually recognizing Carol Ann like that, it is amazing. but which leads to now people in First Nations and communities taking equity stakes in all these projects. And you've seen the whole growth from seemed like very little into now sometimes First Nations seem to be better at solving equity problems than corporations, right? Or project owners, which is fascinating. So please tell us what you're doing with Cedar Leaf Capital.
And what is Cedar Leaf Capital?
So first of all, I do want to say that, like, when it comes to equity positions and so on, it is absolutely exciting to see, because the two of you are sort of at the forefront and participating in some of these projects, so you know them intimately well. And the fact that you see these communities really looking at some of the capital they have, trying to figure out how to raise the capital for an equity position, just demonstrates how developed, and I don't mean to use the word mature saying that we were immature, but it's just like the business cycle where your business becomes mature over a period of time. And I think for Indigenous business, we're just kind of getting towards the cusp of that, right? And so the level of sophistication, again, you guys have seen this, the level of sophistication for some of these projects is quite remarkable, hiring some of the best lawyers, the best accountants, finance people. And you're seeing like remarkable leadership coming from development corporations, some, right in your own home province, right, of British Columbia. Cedar Leaf Capital is an exciting endeavor. So the first thing I'm going to tell you right off the bat is that it's in front of the regulator. And so this is no operational activity. It is a regulatory process that we have to go through. Every single investment dealer to become a dealer member with Cero has to kind of go through this. So it's a very comprehensive application that goes anywhere from, you have to have your place of business established, you have to have some of your executive and approved people already hired, you have to have your business plan put together and your financials and so on. So it is a pretty comprehensive process. Ultimately, what Cedar Leaf wants to do, and what our goal is to be involved in debt capital markets. When you look at, so this would be working with publicly traded companies, as well as with provincial governments and some municipal governments across the country. When you look at some of the largest public issuers of the companies in Canada, many of them, up to 70% of them, actually have a public commitment to working with Indigenous communities. And so some of those businesses have done a job in terms of the procurement side and working and bring some of these businesses along. They've done and are committed to working and hiring Indigenous people. But now, because they're actually going to be raising money on the bond market that would enable them to participate and raise capital for particular projects, now we actually have capital, which is Indigenous owned by 3 major Indigenous shareholders across the country, and with a 30% stake owned by Scotiabank. And we want to be involved initially as a member of the junior member of syndicates that are involved in the new issuance of these bonds, and goal of growing and expanding beyond that, and hopefully looking at equities and then investment banking, financial advisory, M&A, and things of that nature. We really see us as a catalyst to help facilitate greater participation by Indigenous communities and businesses in capital markets. Franks is going to be, if successful and if approved, will be the first ever majority Indigenous owned investment dealer in Canada. And because and to me, it represents economic reconciliation in action. It is participating in an area where we have been historically excluded, and now we're going to have strong ownership in the space, and hopefully enabling us to be able to facilitate greater participation in the market.
Yeah, amazing. And just incredible what you and your group have done there. Are you able to mention who the participating stakeholders are?
Yeah, for sure. So we have 3 incredible shareholders. They've had a long-standing relationship with Scotiabank. So as you can imagine, this is a commercially sensitive endeavor. And so in order to try and do this, we wanted to be first to market and at least getting our application into the regulator. So everything under NDA, and trying to kind of identify any type of shareholder, Indigenous or not, with an NDA, trying to hire people under an NDA, it was all kind of really challenging, to say the least. But we were so lucky to identify and get the support from 3 incredible shareholders The first, Enchkai Corporation, which is the development corporation for Squamish. The second is Desnede, which is the development corporation for English River out of Saskatchewan. And then the third is Rama First Nation out of Southern Ontario. The great thing about this is that all three of those shareholders have their own business track record. They have their own capital. They have strong leadership, and they have a commitment to diversifying their realm of businesses. And so they saw value behind participating in this. So they're very excited about the opportunity to, capital markets as a way for them to participate, as well as trying to identify some of their own people and other Indigenous people to kind of come in and to be a part of our team.
Yeah, and the geographic outreach is almost perfect, the way that it's laid across the country. I mean, there could be more.
It's interesting. Yeah, it's really interesting, Dean, because we, normally when you see some communities kind of come together, example is the Clearwater deal with the Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia. I mean, it's the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia, right? And it's all just essentially one nation for that province, but they also brought in the Mi'kmaq of Newfoundland and Labrador. The Inuit were involved in, which is the North Warning System. So you see us kind of coming together, we have similar, language, values, et cetera. These are three very different First Nations in very different parts of the country, all with their own sort of commitment to business, responsible business, and commitment to diversifying their portfolio and open market to their people. So they didn't even know each other. So it's kind of neat to sort of bring them together and try to get them. They're all going to serve on a board together. So it's going to be exciting.
It's so incredible. Especially, I used to work for the Squamish Nation for 13 years as their economic development officer. And that's actually, that's where Dean and I met. And also that's where the idea for the TV show got spurred, is by my first portfolio was to really elevate the entrepreneurs within the Squamish Nation. They have a population of 4,100 people right now. And I assisted in my 13 years with a grant opportunity and just really giving support for Indigenous business that helped promote, start and expand over 500 entrepreneurs within that nation out of a 4,100 person membership, which is incredible, which just attests to how supported that nation is in respect of business and how forward thinking they are. When I worked there, we didn't have an economic development corporation. It was just, we need to get this going forward. And over the last 7 years, with Sanok, with one of their projects underneath the Broad Street Bridge, beautiful project underneath there for development, with wood fiber, LNG, with the impact benefit agreements with all of the Fortises and the BC Hydros. But most importantly, what you're talking about today is how forward-thinking BC usually is in respect of culture and progression for its people. And then you've got two other different partners that are very progressive in so many other different ways. So it's what a great amalgamation of and choices of partnerships that give a different view of very fast progression to established progression to I think it's a really great project and a pilot for other First Nations to view and watch, and how exciting it is to be a part of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that so many nations can achieve, and just really puts it out there. It's great.
Yeah, that Squamish Nation really got it together after I left.
They just really took off.
Yeah, they took all my advice after I left and just did what I always wanted to do anyway.
Yeah, she said it would never fly when it came up.
Yeah, this will never work. Just kidding.
You know what? I do hope that we, as you just said, this is a catalyst. We would love to see, other communities kind of coming together and not necessarily going in competition with us initially, but certainly trying to partner, because as the three of us know, there's strength in partnership, right? You don't need to have this one entity that's going to be all things to all people. Sean Willie is going to be on my board. He just personifies that, and he constantly looks for partnership and to kind of leverage the respective skills and strengths of the organizations. I wouldn't be surprised as a result of this kind of, work together and co-ownership, that two or maybe three of those First Nations will kind of go off and try to do another business as well in a different sector, right? Like it wouldn't surprise me in the least. And I think that's, again, just demonstrating that level of sophistication and maturity on our businesses now in 2024.
Well, I think too that a lot of nations think that they think costs all the time. This is going to cost to have this person or leadership, whether Indigenous or non-Indigenous, to lead the board or be the chair or what have you. A lot of nations have the thought of it's just a cost instead of an investment, and you have to spend money to make money, and you have to be really forward thinking when it comes to that and think of it. And I think too many nations just think that way, that it's just costing. We don't want to spend any more money on it, but you don't have any progressive movement. And I think this is a really great, it's a really great initiative. And Chief Clarence Louie, he says a lot of great things, and he's very profound. But he talks about sharing the wealth of information and education for the progression of others, and that is not to silo your secrets about this is what's working, or these are the barriers and challenges, and this is how we can progress unified. There's enough work out there. There's enough investments. There's enough developments. There's enough opportunities for all of us, but we need to work together and just really watch each other and elevate each other with our ideas and really share our information.
That's just very well said. And I think it is a template for that lesson. And I think, as younger entrepreneurs that, again, the two of you see on a regular basis, I think they kind of get that. I really do. I really, even what we've seen with the show, it was just so funny how, not funny, I suppose, but it was pleasantly surprising to see, despite the fact that those entrepreneurs were in a competition, on their downtime, they were coming together and spending some time together. And so hopefully looking at opportunities for collaboration and partnership, right?
And it really is. It's what we like to call co-opetition with the show specifically. And if our viewers and listeners haven't seen The Bears Lair or heard about The Bears Lair, it's an entrepreneur show, but it is really about social impact. It's really about elevating each other. We have specifically strategic, non-competitive businesses that are on with each other. We specifically and strategically got them into Vancouver a week prior to the filming of this show, so that they could get to know each other and they could really work off each other. And it's nerve-wracking when you're on a national TV show. You were on set. We are not TV performers, but we had a really great production company called Bright Light. We had an amazing director, and she was incredible, and of course our director of photography. They were just such professionals. But to meet 18 entrepreneurs, the prize is $100,000 for sure. But being able to get to know, there wasn't any era of competition. It really was co-opetition. And what was your experience of coming on the show, and what was it? I know that when you were asked, it's great to have that in you. Representation. You've got Tabitha, you've got Dave, you've got me. We're all from different parts and areas and different cultures. What was it like to be on the show?
Professional this experience was, and the team that you built around that, Geena, it was quite remarkable. The diversity of the entrepreneurs, I thought was just tremendous, pulling them from all parts of the country, and they're involved in a variety of different activities from, in some instances, the potential for major projects like, renewable energy, right down to, some retail activity and so on. And so there isn't an area of business that we're not involved in as people. And these are individuals who, are willing to say, I'm going to take a risk. And I thought that was just incredible, and putting their own money and their own capital into making sure that what they want to do is they want to do their own thing to kind of achieve their own livelihood, right? And I just thought that was outstanding. And there was such a great kind of camaraderie with all the judges, and a really good interaction, and all the guest judges that you would bring on board as well. They were great. They actually came on board, and they were involved with us intimately and seamlessly. And the show worked really, really well. Unfortunately, we never had a lot of time in order to kind of really go deep on stuff, but that's what happens when you're under time constraints and trying to put forward a great television show as well.
Yeah, it really was a great experience. And why we wanted to do the show is I'm working with so many entrepreneurs. There's so many barriers with financial help. Number one, if you live on a reserve, then you don't have that capital or the assets where a bank will conventionally look at you and say, well, if you don't really own anything, do you? Right. And it's hard to develop credit and have opportunities. Can you maybe talk about your history with working with entrepreneurs or being an entrepreneur yourself, and how maybe things have shifted now where the banks are having specific programs where they are more understanding of the barriers and really putting some extra effort into helping entrepreneurs make it?
So all the major banks now anyway, have a good understanding around lending on reserve. Now, having said that, the majority of that is happening in terms of lending with the community as opposed to the individual entrepreneur. So I think the individual entrepreneur, it's still a challenge. If there is a kind of a quasi, mortgage that they can actually have, if an individual who owns their house has a bit of a mortgage, they have the ability to draw down a line of credit. So that's a bit of access to capital for themselves, for a small business. But the one thing I always thought was funny, we used to, at the bank, they'd ask, like, if the bank can't do anything for you. And I think, when I was there, it was a challenge for any small business to try and get capital and from a bank. But they'd say, well, you should go to your friends and family. And I'm like, well, okay, so have you been to an Indigenous community before? And, it's not like that, there's some wealthy aunt that's sitting around, just kind of doling out cash. Like chances are people are probably, and I can speak from my own kind of experience, relatively strapped, and they don't necessarily have an extra 10 grand kicking around to kind of support you in your endeavor to set whatever that's up. So, I think there still is a lot of work that has to be done in support of the individual entrepreneur. I think there's a lot of progress that's happened, particularly in supporting communities to participate in larger projects and other economic opportunities. But for the individual entrepreneur, I still think NACA is just, it's the network for Indigenous financial institutions is just a vital source of capital and support. And you had the rise of Raven Capital, which again is just another venture, right, that enables businesses, if they qualify, that can give them that access to capital. And so, there has been some development, but still, for the individual entrepreneur, a lot of work is still left to go.
Yeah, Clint, do you have any advice to upcoming entrepreneurs or young people that are, we have the youth camps. We're trying to teach them about, you can go into business. You really need a dream and a lot of work. And, I think it replicates a lot what you've done. You've done it all, though. You've had education, you've worked for institutions, you've become an entrepreneur. But for young people, what are the keys that you would suggest, or what is important?
So this is one thing which I don't necessarily have at times. It's just having this sort of unbridled or unparalleled optimism. You see the success of entrepreneurs where they know they're so committed to the work that they're doing, and they live and breathe it. Because as an entrepreneur, as the two of you have to live and breathe it, right? And so trying to maintain that eternal optimism, I think, is key. Having grit, it's not necessarily the smartest person in the room that is going to be successful, but it's the individual that stays focused and is willing to get things done regardless of what's happening around him or her. And I think the third thing is just, really starting to understand the administrative aspects of business, right? So not all of it is, trying to be involved in, M&A or trying to do something really cool where you're expanding your business or you're hiring, 50 people or whatever. It's the administrative things to make sure that you get your shareholder agreement in place, if that's what you want to do, that you get, your taxation papers ready, you get all your corporate documents ready. and stay on top of that. Like, to me, you can outsource that. And if that's what you want to do, that's great. But I think for any entrepreneur, they should get a handle on that, because that's kind of the very foundation of the business as well too. So
Great advice.
I think that we teach kids camps all over Canada, as you know, and it's really interesting because anytime we get to the financial literacy piece, which is we get the kids to choose a business, then choose a name for a business, we identify the target market, and then we start with then based on our target market, we give the kids a $10,000 hypothetical budget to put towards their business. And I think there's a lot of barriers and pain points when it comes to finances, because we've had Synergy Credit Union, for example, did a guest spot speaking about credit. And as soon as we did that, the kids are like, no, credit is bad. Credit cards are bad. My mom said it's bad, never to get one, that it's going to put in date. You're going to get people calling you, et cetera. So this generational perception of what finances mean with a business, like not doing your taxes and what's taxable, what's not taxable in respect of working on reserve and being First Nations in the first place. And what happens if you sell something internationally or province to province? You need to have experts. And I always pitch this book because it's called Who Not How, and it's by Dan Sullivan. And it's really finding the who's. You know what you do really well, and finding the who's being capacity and support within your nations, because many nations do have support for you. If they don't, then they certainly have partners like Scotiabank. Many nations have trusts that they have trust representation from, or accounting firms like Deloitte or Grant Thornton or what have you that they deal with that can assist. And I think it's up to the entrepreneur to also be your own agent and to go out and be your own champion as well and ask some questions, because there is education available through your nation. There is resources through your nation if you have an economic development department. And a lot of economic development departments or corporations now are really focused on capital projects where it's big money. And the forgotten ones are the small entrepreneurs, either micro, medium, or heading to the macro level where they're developing partnerships. So I think that would be a lot of advice. And if I'm going into Scotiabank, with you being a senior advisor, having all of my ducks in a row and knowing then when to ask for help, because the institutions like Scotiabank are there to help you as well and help you get organized. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
No, I think that's fantastic. As I understand it, I mean, they have a very, very strong, robust Indigenous financial services area as well. And my good friend and colleague, John Davey, actually led that before he went over to the CEO's office. So another individual, Dana Martin, out of Vancouver, is leading that area. And while they're primarily focused, obviously, on the business side, like in terms of business with communities and so on, they are committed to certainly working with entrepreneurs. And I think the biggest thing, exactly what you're saying, Geena, is if the bank isn't able, because of sort of their own risk policy constraints, able to provide some sort of loan or whatever it could be in the short term, at the very least, what they'll do, and I think Scotiabank does a very good job of this, is provide you, some additional advice and support that I think would be of value, and maybe even making the right connections for you in order to get that administrative support for your business as well too. So I think they're probably leaders in the space when it comes to Indigenous entrepreneurs, but again, still a lot of work.
For sure. I have a little story quickly. So we were up at the Cayuse Nation just out of Lillooet, and we had a few teams. We had 3 teams of kids, 17 kids altogether, thinking about a business. So my team specifically, it's interesting with Indigenous entrepreneurs where you see a gap within of something and you want to create it. So they don't have a hotel. They do not have a big luxury hotel. They have motels and what have you, and it's kind of in the fire ring zone, Lillooet area. So they wanted to do a big glamorous hotel that was going to be about $50 million. And, we're dealing with 11, 12, 13-year-olds. So it's big pie in the sky, and trying to be a coach, as I was, and facilitator, to maneuver them. And they're so smart. They said, well, why don't we just get the nation to donate the land? And then they can be a partner. And then we could take a, 20% of the profits every single year forever. And then we can employ our members and what have you. And it just warms my heart to think that these kids are listening to leaders about ideas about how that you can have unique ways of doing business with industry and really developing. And I think that's what Cedar Leaf is. It's so interesting to see something like that, where those kind of conversations are being heard by youth and to be able to promote such a great initiative. So thank you. And how long do you think it's going to be until this is going to happen?
Well, I don't have a specific date. I would love to if that was the case, but we're hoping that we'll hear something from the regulators sometime in the fall. And our goal, if everything works out, to be operational either late in the calendar year or early in the calendar year.
Fantastic. Well, really great conversation as usual. We could talk for hours with you. You're just so lovely to speak to, and it's just a wealth of knowledge.
Yeah, I know. Can't wait to see you next week. Catch up. That'll be great. And you got to get to Vancouver soon too.
Yeah, awesome. I love it. I can't wait. And thank you so much for the opportunity here. It is such an honor for me to be a polar bear on top of that.
Yes.
So knocking out of the park with everything you do. And I'm just excited to be a part of that. So Nakumek, thank you.
Amazing. So everybody can tune in and see Clint Davis on the Bears Lair. It's starting June 4th, every single Tuesday. 9 episodes. We have a great contest with Indigenous Tourism Association Canada, where somebody can win a $20,000 trip for 4. And you can tune in and see this handsome gentleman with all of the rest of the bears, so you can see the polar bear. So thank you so much, Clint Davis. Such a pleasure to have you.
I like it. The polar bear.
The polar bear.
Thanks a lot.
Okay. Have a great day.
Great.
Thanks for listening to Beyond the Lair. Please follow us, download this episode, and follow us on social media on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and TikTok.